Welcome back. This week we're talking about urban life and urbanization. Macionis chapter 14. Let's start off with the question of what is the history of cities? Cities have been around pretty much as far back as recorded history. Trade, commerce, politics, etc. have always been centered in cities and then spread outward from the center. Historically, every city was its own state, consisting of its own government, economic system, military, etc. These have been known as, surprise, city-states. But starting about 1500 years ago, cities began collecting themselves into nations, collections of cities that share a common cultural heritage. Now, what are some purposes of cities? Aside from the political and economic necessities mentioned above, cities have historically been the center of one or more industries. During the Industrial Revolution, cities grew in leaps and bounds as people from rural areas moved into the cities looking for work. Cities have almost always been concerned with sanitation and disease. From the earliest Egyptian, Greek, and Roman cities, there had to be a way to get water to the people and to remove waste. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, cities grew so quickly that these services couldn't keep up. As a result, disease spread easily, and residents, especially the poor, saw high mortality rates, including high rates of infant mortality. Cities also tend to serve as the organizing center for law enforcement. While counties in U.S. states are responsible for the criminal court system, enforcing the laws has been up to city-level police departments. How did cities change during the 20th century? The invention of the automobile, the onset of mass transportation, the decreasing cost of building housing, and advances in communication technologies have led to the growth of some cities to encompass hundreds of square miles, for example, Los Angeles. The growth of suburbs, parts of urban areas that lie outside of the city center but provide many, if not all, of the same services one could find inside the city. Suburbs have been around since the 18th century, but in the U.S., it wasn't around until the 1950s and 1960s that they really grew in leaps and bounds. What about small towns and rural areas? Until the Industrial Revolution, the majority of the population lived in small towns and rural areas. They were characterized by farming and cottage industries, business or manufacturing taking place in someone's home. Especially since the mid-20th century, farming became far less of a family business and more corporate. Larger farms could be planted and managed with larger machinery and fewer people, so many folks whose families had traditionally been in farming left rural areas for the cities. Cottage industries have been replaced by large-scale manufacturing since the late 19th century, again forcing families who used to rely on the cottage industry to move to the cities to find work. So cities have grown in size and population over the last century or so. What kinds of social problems has this presented? Well, with many people retreating from city centers into the suburbs, the economic and political dominance of central cities has declined. Buildings that were built during the late 19th and early 20th centuries were not being used as much, fewer people to work in them or live near them, so they have fallen into decay. This is more true of cities in the northeastern U.S., which saw its boom in city growth much earlier than the rest of the country. Now, many sociologists have pointed to social disorganization theory to describe the changes that have occurred in such cities. Social disorganization is defined as the breakdown of social institutions within a community. Robert Park and Ernest Burgess published The City in 1925, and they proposed the concentric zone model to describe how populations live and transition through cities. In 1942, Clifford Shaw and Henry Mackay published Juvenile Delinquency and Urban Areas. Now, Shaw and Mackay applied the concentric zone model and actually mapped crime and delinquency rates and demographics so they could see who was committing what kinds of crimes and where. They demonstrated that each more recent group of immigrants moved from Zone 2 to Zone 3 to Zone 4, so those zones moving outward. If high delinquency rates also moved from Zone 2 to Zone 3 to Zone 4 as the immigrant groups moved, then the delinquency was likely due to the specific immigrant groups. If high delinquency remained in Zone 2, which it did, then something about Zone 2 was amiss. In other words, high rates of delinquency could not be associated with the different immigrant groups and thus must be a part of the ecological environment. Zone 2 is characterized by high levels of social disorganization. Families are disrupted and dysfunctional. Schools were disorderly and ineffectual. Very few adult-run activities for youth. Churches were poorly attended and had little influence in the community. Political groups were ineffective. Sean McKay described these as criminogenic influences. Social disorganization theory is attributed to the Chicago School of Urban Sociology, a collection of professors from the University of Chicago who have, over the years, advanced explanations of crime, failing schools, and joblessness, just to name a few, to social disorganization. Many cities have seen similar changes over the past several decades. Not all cities fit the concentric zone model. Many, including Denver, fit what is known as a multiple nuclei model, i.e., more than one nucleus. Think multiple concentric zones, each with its own transitional zone, working class zone, residential zone, etc. In the Denver metropolitan area, you can see examples of this in Lakewood, Aurora, Arvada, Littleton, etc. The major point to understand about social disorganization theory is that the social problems that cities face cannot easily be attributed to a certain age group, like teenagers, a certain race or ethnicity, like minorities, a certain sex or gender, like males, etc., of the people who live in them. Instead, these social problems exist because of a lack of cohesion in the social institutions in the city: religion, education, government participation, etc. So that's urbanization in a nutshell. Have a great week, and I'll see you online.